Good morning. My name is Ellen Pitts, and I am the second person to come between you and Douglas Brinkley. Welcome to the 16th Annual Savannah Book Festival. This year's festival is presented by the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, with a special thanks to a grant from the Georgia Humanities. We are especially grateful to Judy and Gary Lautzenheiser for sponsoring the Lutheran Church of the Ascension today. I'd also like to welcome our generous sponsors and our literati members. It is through your support that we are able to make Festival Saturday free to the public. 90% of our revenue comes from our donors and literati members, and we thank you. This year's festival is full of great events and authors, and the best way to make sure you don't miss any of it is to download the Savannah Book Festival app on your phone. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. Douglas Brinkley will be signing festival purchase copies of his book in Telfair Square immediately following the presentation. If you are planning to stay for the next author, Patrick Radden Keefe, please move forward after Douglas is done speaking. Of course, please take this moment to make sure that your cell phone is silent. We also ask that you do not use flash photography, and due to its recent restoration, there is to be absolutely no eating or drinking in the sanctuary. On the back of your program, you'll find a QR code for a survey. If you can, please take a moment to share your opinion. Your input will help us improve the festival, and it will make an impact on donations for the arts in Savannah. Later, as you exit, you will see volunteers with yellow buckets, and we do hope you'll consider making a donation to the Savannah Book Festival. We will have the opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the talk. Please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone so everyone can hear your question. Douglas Brinkley is here today, courtesy of Mark and Mitzi Toth, as well as Catherine and Michael Bryson. Douglas Brinkley is the Catherine Zanoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and the New York Historical Society's presidential historian. His most recent books are American Moonshot, The Great Deluge, Cronkite, The Quiet World, The Wilderness Warrior, Rightful Heritage. 6 of his books have been selected as New York Times Notable Books of the Year. He lives in Texas with his wife and 3 children. Please give a warm Savannah welcome to Douglas Brinkley.
Good morning. Thank you for all being here. Mark and Mitzi, thank you for being such incredible sponsors and hosts. I really appreciate you. And my wife, Ann, is here with me, and I've always wanted to speak in front of a congregation and have a flock, and this is my moment. I'm going to relish every second up here. Beautiful facility. In fact, when I was waiting to come in, the plaque in front of the church shows that somebody that I write about in my book, Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, got this declared a National Historic Site, this church, in 1966. And I promise you, this is like many that got saved or honored with that designation due to Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson and their historic preservation work during the Great Society years that doesn't get the proper historical attention it should due to the overwhelming nature of the civil rights movement in Vietnam. Look, I began really my odyssey. I've now written a trilogy, although they're not connected in any major way, of conservation or the environmental movement in America. And I'm going to use, by and large, the term environmental today for time reasons, but it started as conservation, as you probably all know. My book about Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909, I called the book The Wilderness Warrior. TR saved 234 million acres of wild America as a president. That was the first wave of environmental movement. He had been born in 1858 in New York City, Charles Darwin's book on the origins of species came out in 1859. The Roosevelt family was all about Darwin. One of the earliest writings of Theodore Roosevelt's, this is a 7-year-old writing, showing pictures he's drawing. I'm evolving from a stork, my brother from a dog. He'd write Darwin's Theory of Evolution and all this notebooks because his father was founding the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And that was going to be founded on Darwinian principles. So for Theodore Roosevelt, it was a no-brainer. He went to Harvard and basically majored in what today we would call wildlife biology. Back then it was naturalist studies. And he wrote his first book as an undergraduate, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. He would go on to write in a prolific way about the American landscape and species. He wrote about gopher tortoises in Florida, rattlesnakes in New Mexico. He died in his deathbed writing about pheasants. It was part of him. And in that first wave of environmentalism under Theodore Roosevelt, beyond those acreage, he created the U.S. Forest Service of today. If you ever see a map with national forests, it's Theodore Roosevelt and his first chief forester, Gifford Pinchot. And all of you, if you look on a map in Georgia, you'll see how many you have. It's the beginning of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. He saved 51 federal bird reservations, Theodore Roosevelt. Today, you all here in the congregation have owned 550 national wildlife refuges. Roosevelt deeded land in Alaska, the Yukon Delta, the size of West Virginia for species only. So he was taking this very seriously. The second wave, which I found and I wrote about, was FDR. And Roosevelt also was a conservationist. When any time in his entire life Theodore Roosevelt had to put occupation on a form, had to say what it was, he would write tree farmer. And he wasn't kidding. He was born along the Hudson River. He lived his life along the Hudson. He died at is buried at the Hudson River. He died here in Georgia at Warm Springs. But his life was devoted to conservation like Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, FDR, beyond doing, the first New Deal measure, the Civilian Conservation Corps, paying unemployed people suffering, homeless, or unsure how to earn a living. He paid them $1 a day to plant trees and fix park areas up and restock lakes and rivers with fish, that sort of endeavor. You know how many trees the CCC, the Corps, planted between 1933 and 1942? 3 billion. They planted 3 billion trees because we had clear-cut America. We had drained our swamps. We had gotten rid of our hardwood forest. We had a dust bowl through the Great Plains. We had done sloppy agriculture without taking scientific method into play. We didn't adopt Pinchotian scientific forestry principles to our national holdings writ large. And I can go, like Theodore Roosevelt, TR was the great one for the Antiquities Act of 1906, which means executive power to save places. It was meant for dinosaur bones and Native American pottery. And the idea was like the plastic of a murder site today or something, or a dig site. They put it around an acre, 6 acres, because the Europeans were coming to America, the museums of Europe, were stealing our dinosaur bones that they were finding in the West and antiquities of Native Americans. So under the Antiquities Act, it said a president, in the name of science, can save a parcel of land for perpetuity for the American people. That was the spirit of this elastic legislation. Theodore Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon, stood at it. They were going to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper, and said, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." and they went ahead to go mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper. They did not want it as a national park. In order to become a national park, it has to go through Congress. So TR did that with Crater Lake in Oregon, or Mesa Verde in Colorado, Wind Cave, South Dakota, and others. But the canyon they wanted to mine, and Roosevelt signs an executive order which was really meant for 6 acres and applied it when it becomes 1 million acres. And it goes to the courts. He gets sued. It gets seen as illegal, and TR wins in the courts. And now presidents have the right to sign sweeping executive orders to save nature, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt. I dealt with Barack Obama personally and on ones in Nevada and in the San Juan Islands of Washington when Ken Salazar and Sally Jewell were in Interior to save some of these places. And FDR, beyond all the national parks I could tell you he did, 800 state parks were born out of the New Deal, 800. So that was the first wave environmental. Second wave, the book I've written, Silent Spring, the end of it is the third wave. And it's closer to our own times, and it doesn't have a Roosevelt attached to it. I wanted to begin it in 1960, and with Kennedy, Nixon, Ansel Adams and the Sierra Club brought out a book called This is the American Earth, which was this surprise best-selling book. Wallace Stegner, the great novelist, wrote this wilderness essay that's unbelievable piece of American literature. And then Kennedy's New Frontier was thought that Truman and Eisenhower were siding too much with the extraction industries, and they were going to rectify it, the Kennedyites, with more on the environment. But it turned out I couldn't begin it in 1960 when I really did my research. And my friend David is here, who just wrote the incredible book on Jim Thorpe, and he knows this as well as anybody. You know, you start writing, you discover new things, and you sometimes have to take the new information and make it work. In my case, the modern third wave environmental movement began with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It began with the end of World War II. It began because Dr. New Deal, FDR, said, I'm becoming Dr. Win the War. And to win the war, there were no regulations. Everything went. Presto, Aladdin's lamp, chemistry of any kind, for any kind of munitions, chemicals, defoilants, preservatives, and anything was green lit. And with the bomb, when they're dropped, with the victory over Japan, there became a group of public scientists that said, what have we wrought? What is this the doom of humanity? How are we going to keep these bombs so only the United States has them? And we had a monopoly from 1945 to 49. The only time it'll be in world history where one country had a nuclear monopoly, us, for 4 years. Russia gets the bomb in 49, but we start testing nuclear weapons. Willy-nilly, we blow bombs up in Nevada and the Marshall Islands. And from 1945, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to 1992, under George Bush, we detonated 1,054 nuclear weapons in the United States. 1,054. Now, Kennedy, who I write about in the book, due to pressures from people like Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King and a man named Norman Cousins I'm going to mention, eventually signs the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, his greatest act as president, which can be looked at as a Cold War act, but it's also an ecological act. He banned, and this is Kennedy's own initiative, banning of testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere above water. So today we're all here in the pews. Nobody's going to be testing a nuclear weapon above ground or underwater due to that Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed between Russia, Great Britain, and the United States. But Kennedy went operating in a bubble. From 45 to 63, when he signed that, the pressure to stop nuclear testing was intense. Dr. King Martin Luther King Jr. was said something like this over and over again in different iterations, that what good does it do to integrate the lunch counter at Greensboro, North Carolina, if the milk you're drinking has strontium-90 in it, meaning contaminants? And all of those bombs blowing up in Nevada, the scientists started saying people are getting sick. There's cancer spikes, leukemia spikes. Incidentally, guys, here in Georgia, I wrote a book on Jimmy Carter. And I'm going to tell you that, well, before I mention Carter, let me tell you, so there's that nuclear contamination concern. And the second one is DDT. Now, DDT and pesticides were a miracle in World War II. If I were in the military, I'd say, spray me down. And they did. John F. Kennedy got sprayed, and Richard Nixon got sprayed, and LBJ got sprayed. They fought in the Pacific. It killed lice. It killed mosquitoes. It killed ticks. It was going to prevent malarial diseases, and it did. And it was a miracle. But lo and behold, after World War II, a lot of government scientists at Pawtuxet, Maryland's Wildlife Research Center said, this is killing the fish. It's thinning the eggs of eagles and falcons. It's going to be detrimental to human health. So the two things that won the war in a lot of ways due to American scientific ingenuity, the atomic bomb and DDT, are now the bane of public scientists that are investigating, saying these things have got to be deeply controlled. And I mentioned Jimmy Carter. Do you realize here in Georgia, Sumter County, Carter left for the Navy. He went to the Naval Academy and then lived all over in the Navy. That decade he was gone from Georgia, they sprayed all over Sumter County DDT pesticides over the fields, cotton, peanuts. Do you realize Jimmy Carter's mother died of pancreatic cancer? His father died of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy died of pancreatic cancer. Sister Ruth died of pancreatic cancer. Sister Gloria died of pancreatic cancer. It wasn't a joke, these chemicals, guys. It really was detrimental to human health. And out of all this in the 50s emerges a person who's, and my book's named after, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was from Pennsylvania, Springdale. And as a little girl, she saw how polluted the Allegheny River was from glue factories and industrial debris. A dirty, dirty river in that beautiful part of western Pennsylvania. She became a naturalist. As a girl, she would write about things in her backyard like children will do. She collected nests and leaves and all of this. She started writing essays for St. Nicholas magazine as a girl, which is hard to do. It's a competition. She went to college at Chatham outside of Pittsburgh, a women's school as it was called then, women's college. And she found she had two callings. Science, biology, nature writing in the Darwin tradition, and true literary poetic writing like Henry David Thoreau. She mixes them both, and she gets a scholarship to go to Woods Hole. Woods Hole, Massachusetts was ground zero for ocean studies. It was the Carnegie Hall and Harvard combined. It is just down the road from Hyannisport. You can walk the Kennedy compound to Woods Hole without too much trouble. But at Woods Hole, trawlers would come in, they'd find new sea urchins and the like, kind of like Beaufort in the Carolinas or something, or Miami today, or Scripps out in California. And she got first interested in writing about eels, because they have a migratory journey from Africa. She was always asking herself, how could the eel in a Pennsylvania river have come from Africa? And then she started writing about shad, about cod. She got an advanced degree at Johns Hopkins in zoology. She started writing a nature outdoor column, if you like, for the Baltimore Sun. World War II hits. She writes radio broadcasts about the oceans and begins and starts her trilogy on the oceans. I'm at a book festival here in Savannah. If you've never read Rachel Carson on the Oceans, please do. She wrote 3 beautiful books. They're conveniently acquired in the Library of America, those black volumes, if you like, all in one. But nobody writes about ocean life, seashore life, with the beauty and integrity of Rachel Carson. She skyrocketed, was a best-selling writer in the 50s. Rose Kennedy was a fanatic, John F. Kennedy's mother. John F. Kennedy loved Rachel Carson. And yet she wanted to write about DDT poisoning the planet and nuclear fallout. She had been rejected in 1945 by Reader's Digest when she tried to do a warning shot about DDT. And now in the late 50s, this best-selling author, and I mean, it's not like being on the bestseller list for 6 weeks or something. Her books were on like 36 weeks, 45 weeks. She was killing it. She was famous. She was the Jacques Cousteau of the oceans. And a case came up by a woman named Marjorie Spock. How many of you in here, if you'd raise your hands, remember who Dr. Benjamin Spock was? That tells you we have an older audience. But he was a big deal, as you remember, with the baby book and all that. Well, his sister, Marjorie Spock, she was an organic farmer in Long Island, Suffolk County, and she wanted to grow only organic produce. Perfect. And today that makes really great sense. It was a little unusual back then because everybody was crazy about pesticides, killing off the insects. They were blanket spraying Long Island, Suffolk County Mosquito Control, and the United States Department of Agriculture. And she sues and says, you're taking away my constitutional right to be an organic farmer. You're spraying my organic farm, and you're taking my job away. I can't be an organic farmer. Anyway, you slice it, it's a fascinating question. What is the space over your property that, where to, for law school, it's a bonanza of ways to think about the things and to apply law. But it goes to the Supreme Court, and she loses. Only one person was on her side, William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice from FDR's revenge when he tried to pack the Supreme Court and they nixed it. He's got the youngest justice ever, Justice Douglas, in, and Douglas was a fervent, fanatical environmentalist. And I'll tell you about him in a second. But when the case, what Rachel Carson then did is she got all of Marjorie Spock's, when you do a Supreme Court case, you develop quite a load of papers and data and reports. She inherited all of that, and then her whistleblowers, if you like, in the federal government, in Fish and Wildlife, gave her all of their research reports on the poisoning of DDT. So it's like Santa Claus. She had 2 piles next to her of incredible info, and she started writing her book, Silent Spring, which would come out in 1962. She wrote it while she was suffering from cancer. She had breast cancer, lost all of her hair, was going through chemo. It metastasized through her whole body. She would be dead by 1964, and her book came out in 62. She was racing against the clock to finish the book. When it came out, it was a revolution, guys. Very seldom does a book change the world. In American history, Thomas Paine's Common Sense may have done that. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, when Theodore Roosevelt adopted it on meatpacking industries and factory conditions, was one of those kinds of books. I suppose Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is one. There are others. There's a list you can make, but it's rare. And Silent Spring was one of them. It gave birth to the modern third wave environmental movement in '62 because her essays appeared in the New Yorker, but the guy who backed them out of the gate was Bill Douglas. She gave Douglas her early copy, and Douglas sold it all over Washington, including to President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. Bill Douglas was from Yakima, Washington, was crippled as a boy, learned how to walk, became a hobo and a hotshot in New York at Columbia Law, went on to Yale to be the Sterling Professor of Law, and in 1933 was hired by Joseph Kennedy to help him run the Stock Exchange Commission to bust fake bankruptcy claims. So he understood the corporate world and how to bust bad actors in the corporate structure. And he starts hiking and writing about the natural world. For example, in the mid-1950s, he wants to ban a road that would destroy the C&O Canal from Georgetown in Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. He claims it has scientific and historic resources and it belongs to the American people and that the canal, the whole length, needs to be preserved. He walks and hikes in a protest hike as surely as Dr. King was marching. Douglas marched 186 miles with a band of environmentally minded people, including editors of the Washington Post, and he won the saving of the C&O Canal. After Douglas wins the C&O Canal, he's protest drunk on the environment. He goes with Bobby Kennedy and Ethel to Washington State and hikes and camps along the Olympic to preserve a road not being built to have a stretch of open beach there. He goes to Kentucky and stops a dam. He goes to Arkansas in canoes to save the Buffalo River as a scenic river. He goes to Texas to save the Big Thicket area along Louisiana bayous and the Guadalupe Mountains out in West Texas. On and on. And there is no EPA. There is no Clean Air Act. There is no Clean Water Act. There is no sanitation laws. So Douglas's Supreme Court office was a clearinghouse for every environmental group in the country. If you had something here that you wanted done in Savannah regarding environmental integrity or not in my backyard conservationism or whatever, you'd be writing Bill Douglas. He organized this whole thing. He was not a good Supreme Court justice. He was an extraordinarily radical and influential environmentalist. And his friends were the Kennedys. He took Bobby Kennedy all the way, the Attorney General during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He went hiking all over with Bobby. He took Bobby Kennedy to Siberia to hike. And in Siberia, Bobby got 104 fever, and they was in a hut, and there was no antibiotic. And Douglas, the next morning, with Bobby burning up, straps on his backpack and says, "This is where men must part. I'll see you, Bobby," and left him there in Siberia. Ethel Kennedy told me she was so livid she wouldn't talk to Bill Douglas for 5 years. But what it was this macho Darwinian, you may not survive, so I have to carry on. Douglas is wired an unusual way. He was married 4 times. Last time he was in his 70s and his wife was in his 20s. And he was a bane of the existence of extraction industries. Bill Douglas writes, in writing to a professor of law at Yale, "I am going to bend the law in favor of the environment and against the corporation." From the Supreme Court justice. So that's what we're dealing with him, okay? And when Rachel Carson finishes her chapters, she gives them to Bill Douglas. And he says, "They're going to come after you, Rachel. They're going to just try to destroy you, the chemical industries, but I got the Kennedys." And sure enough, when Rachel, it shows up, her writing shows up in the New Yorker, and they call her a lesbian, hysterical woman, and blah, blah, blah. They try to smear her, the chemical and agro conglomerates, because to regulate pesticides by the federal government means Uncle Sam's gonna be watching everything you do, everything you dump, determining and labeling what's toxic or not. So it was the DDT wars. And John F. Kennedy at the podium, when asked, said, "We're looking into Miss Carson's work, and we'll get a scientific advisory committee." He did. Best minds, science minds in America came and said DDT's terrible for human health. But from 1962 to her book, it doesn't get banned in North America till 1972. It took 10 years of the DDT wars. And you know who bans DDT in the end? Richard Nixon. due to the insistence of a first head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus. And Ruckelshaus, like Kennedy, Ruckelshaus, a Republican from Indiana, said, give me the info and I'm going to weigh in as EPA and call balls and strikes. And found out that Rachel Carson was right. But as I just mentioned, Kennedy and Rachel Carson had one other big thing in common, the love of the oceans, like all of you do here in Savannah. They were seashore people. I'll ask all of you just to ponder, what is your Walden Pond? What in your life place in the natural world speaks to you? Is it, a place here along the coast? It is a place in Connecticut? And Jack Kennedy's Walden, he learned to swim in Walden because Rose Kennedy fought for saving anything Thoreau. She worked for the CIA on a mission to Russia to make sure the Russian libraries carried the collected works of Henry David Thoreau, John F. Kennedy's mother. And Thoreau wrote a book called Cape Cod that people often don't read. They read the Maine Woods and they read Walden and they don't read Cape Cod. But in the Kennedy house, Cape Cod was a big deal. And Jack Kennedy in the late 50s, Bill Douglas got Jack and said, I think Justice Douglas didn't know how bad John F. Kennedy's back really was. I don't think anybody did. But he said, Jack, the problem with you, you're always yachting and you're on the water all the time. You don't sleep on the ground. You haven't slept on the ground much. And he said, now you gotta get married to an environmental issue. And after talking, they decided Jack would do seashore preservation. And lo and behold, John F. Kennedy was a show horse, not a workhorse. Playboy more, a heavy legislative lifter. So I don't want to exaggerate, but he does have this amazing environmental accomplishment. He decides to lead the campaign to save Cape Cod National Seashore. And it's out of Kennedy, worried about our vanishing shorelines, that not only in 61 saves Cape Cod, and guys, saving Cape Cod National Seashore is hard. It is not Jimmy Carter saving 1 million acres of the Brooks Range that's just rock that no roads get to and nobody wants. It's in the most desirable real estate imaginable. And Kennedy pulls off a national seashore in Cape Cod next to Truro and Wellfleet and Provincetown and the rest. He does another national seashore, Padre Island, Texas. Look on a map how large a part of the Gulf Coast is preserved as a public beach due to Kennedy. Point Reyes, California, Marin County, the most expensive real estate in America, has open national seashore because of Jack Kennedy and his influence by Rachel Carson in seashore protection. And although LBJ had to finish the job, the Kennedy New Frontier under Kennedy Udall, influenced by Rachel Carson and others, had a list of where to save, and it included lakefront seashores, the Great Lakes, which have been a dumping zone. And yet another writer enters the story. Carl Sandburg, the great poet of the Midwest, is demanding the Indiana Dunes be saved between Gary and Chicago. It's called Save the Dunes. It's a brutal fight, and they win. And they win the Apostle Islands, 22 islands in northern Wisconsin, with Gaylord Nelson leading the way, the father of Earth Day. They saved Sleeping Bear Dunes in Michigan, beautiful place, Picture Rock, I could go on. So this seashore movement, so you're seeing what's going on in this third wave. There's this seashore preservation movement, anti-DDT, ban the nuclear testing movements. And they're all coming together with Rachel Carson because Carson is telling you and you and you something different. Conservation isn't about going to Yellowstone. It's not about saying I slept overnight at Cumberland Island. It is Rachel saying it's a public health concern. That you, mom, you, dad, your kids might be getting sick playing in their backyard. Look what's happening in Ohio right now with the toxic. Do you want your kids playing outside right now in that part of Ohio? No. So Carson woke up the movement because she brought in all these people that were concerned about their own kids' health. That becomes environmental. That's when conservation bleeds into environmentalism in this third wave. I mentioned they're gone. Now, when with her Kennedy killed and Rachel Carson gone, the big question is, how will Lyndon and Lady Bird do? They do well. The fear was that Johnson had his own Walden, Pedernales River of Texas. And by the end of his presidency, the man, LBJ, who began his political career on dams, hydropower, dams, rural electrification and dams, and rightfully so, the great ones of FDR, the TVA, the Grand Coulee Dam. But we can all agree, by the 1960s, there was a lot of pork. A lot of Congress people were getting money. I need $100 million for an unnecessary dam. And Johnson was always part of that. It was good Democratic politics. But to his credit, he read a book by John Graves called Goodbye to a River, about the damming of a river in Texas, the Blanco. And he was moved. And more than moved, he started listening about the need to save wild rivers. And two big things LBJ does. In 1967, they're moving to dam the Colorado River, which would flood the Grand Canyon. And Johnson says no. David Brower of the Sierra Club would take out full-page ads in the New York Times about saving the Grand Canyon. Would you flood the Sistine Chapel? Why would we ruin the Grand Canyon? Johnson fell into that and did the right thing. And he also did wild and scenic rivers, taking large stretches of rivers and keeping them in their more primitive, natural, free-flowing state without much human interference, or as little human interference as possible. Lyndon Johnson did the trails, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail with the National Trail Act. He did his own national parks with Stuart Udall, like Canyonlands in Utah, like the North Cascades in Washington, a major campaign. Lady Bird, most known for her anti-billboard crusade to beautify highways and plant wildflowers and all, doesn't get the credit she deserves for going into the redwoods and saving Redwood National Park. She demanded it. The point is, guys, with Lyndon and Lady Bird, they also did Wilderness Act, saving vast millions of acres. You get two, but it's Lady Bird running that show on conservation. But Lyndon and Lady Bird as a unit are very effective conservationists. Why don't they get credit for all they did? And I could tell you much, much more on clean air quality and all of this. Because of Vietnam. And because Johnson, particularly Lyndon, looked at the world not as one pulsing biological organism. He looked at it as American Earth. So he did conservation for America, the United States, while we're bombing and wiping out the Mekong Delta and using defoliants and Agent Orange over there. So it's made it hard to put Lyndon into this sort of pantheon of conservation presidents. But acre by acre, act by act, LBJ is one of the big conservation presidents in U.S. history. And I'll end by telling you Nixon came in. And Nixon is a problem. People are worried that Richard Nixon is going to be terrible. But he hired, when he ran for president in 1968, a man that you might know from Watergate, John Ehrlichman, who went to prison for Watergate. Ehrlichman was a land water lawyer from Puget Sound, Washington. And he was a NIMBY lawyer. You would hire him in Savannah if you didn't want an aluminum factory being built downtown Savannah. You'd hire his firm. Nixon was impressed. This guy's making a lot of money on NIMBY. Rich people not wanting something in their neighborhood. Ehrlichman, as David Brower, who's very radical left at the Sierra Club, he even says Ehrlichman was a covert green in the Nixon White House. Ehrlichman got it all. And Nixon said, I'm doing foreign policy, I've got housing issues, but you, John, I'll sign environmental legislation, do things big. If Ed Muskie gets zero credit, I won't do anything if the senator from Maine, his name is anywhere. So Ruckelshaus forms an alliance with the Democratic senator from Washington, Henry M. Scoob Jackson. And it's the team of Ehrlichman, the Republican, Jackson, the Democrat. Jackson, because Jackson is for the Vietnam War. One of the only Democrats for it. McGovern's not for it. Ted Kennedy's criticizing Nixon on Vietnam. E.G. McCarthy, Gaylord Nelson, Frank Church. But Jackson is kind of a hawk on it. And so Nixon will do business with him. And in 1969, things sped up. You have the Santa Barbara oil spill. 8 days Nixon's in office. Brought in color TV now into our living rooms. Birds stuck in goo. Paradise ruined. And then in the summer of 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire. And the Rouge River caught fire. And by the fall of 1969, Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin who saved the Apostle Islands, comes up with the idea of Earth Day. The first Earth Day to be held April 22nd, 1970. It's going to be a teach-in, building off of the Vietnam War protests. But this is going to teach the world about ecology, the first Earth Day. Nixon's worried that he's going to be the butt of Earth Day. And on January 1, 1970, at San Clemente, California, Richard Nixon surprises everybody and signs the Democratic legislation, claims credit for himself for NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. If NEPA, you think NEPA doesn't affect your life, but it does. NEPA is the birth of environmental law because NEPA says you must have in order to build anything, you have to have an environmental impact statement. If you're going to go, the U.S. government's going to build a fort here tomorrow, what's the environmental impact statement? What does that tell you guys? That's the birth of environmental law. Kids, if some of your grandkids or something are going to college in environmental, it's not just working for the Sierra Club. They can work for ExxonMobil or Walmart or Target or anybody wants environmental impact statements are needed now because of that signing of Nixon. Nixon is worried that, and I ask myself, where did all the money for Earth Day come from? Because everybody's popping up these little offices for Earth Day all over the country. Students, campuses, Earth Day, boom, they're everywhere. Walter Reuther paid all the money, the head of the United Auto Workers. That's how much labor was involved with the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. And Nixon descends to spend Earth Day. He plants one tree on the White House smiling for Earth Day. He gives the Interior Department employees the day off to be part of the teach-in. Great. And he has the FBI do domestic surveillance on all the environmental groups. And one of the funnier documents that you'll ever see is Nixon's Ehrlichman telling Pete McCloskey of California, I got to go see the boss, Nixon, and tell him that the intelligence reports how the FBI showed that there was some nookie, there were kids throwing frisbee, there was a little pot, there were a lot of dogs, nothing much. There were no communists. It was just learning about Earth. Buoyed by that, Nixon creates in the summer of 1970 the Environmental Protection Agency out of the White House, working with Scoop Jackson and John Dingell of Michigan. And the EPA is now law enforcement to call out the bad actors and bust polluters that aren't following the law. Nixon's will do the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and I'll end by telling you the end of Nixon, my book ends in 73, when the Great Endangered Species Act is passed to save the California condor and the bald eagle and the alligator and the rest, manatee. Guess what that passed in the Senate by? 92-0. That's how bipartisan our country was in the third wave. And I ended in 73 because that's when Nixon is going down in Watergate. The Goldwater, or what today you might call Trump Republicans, went after Nixon as becoming a New Dealer, playing footsie with Greens and environmentalists. They threw Nixon under the bus. The oil and gas industry was furious at Nixon. Real estate developers were furious at Nixon. He had no home. Meanwhile, the left had so much fun pounding on Nixon. And alas, we have in 73 the Arab oil embargo, gas prices go up, inflation, and there becomes a counter-revolution against the environmental revolution, which manifests itself a few years later in 1980 when Ronald Reagan becomes president. Thank you all. I have so much more to tell you, but I appreciate you being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we might have time for a few brief questions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone. Okay, we have one. Like the fifth row.
He's right in the middle.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Who says history can't be interesting? The point in 73, my question relates to journalism and coverage of the issue. So the bipartisanship that took place, for the 50 years to then, and then when we think about, I've always been a big believer Watergate changed journalism and the coverage of government, and it seems like that the journalism integrity sort of went one way as far as what truly is an environmental issue and what's a political issue. I just wanted to get your...
Well, the big thing on the environment and the media was Walter Cronkite because, I've written about the astronauts in a book there. All the astronauts thought they were going to the moon, and they did. We have 12 moonwalkers. But they all said the moon was what we thought, flat, no air blowing, just sort of. But Earth, my God, lonely blue, white planet Earth floating in this dark, inky atmosphere. It was a spiritual, religious transformation into the astronauts who saw Earth from that vantage point. And these were hardened engineers that weren't mystics. And they got a spiritual epiphany from it. Well, Walter Cronkite started putting Earthrise photograph taken by the astronaut Bill Anders as his bumper slide nightly. And CBS started saying, like we covered the civil rights movement at King, like we covered Vietnam, we're going to cover the environment every week, all the time. So starting by the time of Santa Barbara in '69, it was Planet in Peril. And by what CBS would do is show, all of any environmental disaster in color. And it really helped raise a kind of awareness. It was bipartisan in the environment because the old hunt fish groups, Trout Unlimited and Boone and Crockett and all of these groups were largely Republicans, but they had joined forces with the Wilderness Society Sierra Club and formed a kind of national coalition. Guys, our air was terrible before the Clean Air Act. You couldn't breathe in Pasadena. You couldn't breathe in New York City. It wasn't light in bio game. I mean, it was, imagine here in beautiful Savannah, you choking and can't breathe, spikes of respiratory illness. So the first Clean Air Act attacked stationary pollution from factories. That was 63. And Nixon signs in 70 the one that goes after automobiles and gets lead out of automobiles. And the triumphant story is we have better air quality because of these federal interventions. And it mattered because nothing screams federal government more than air. You can't really have state air qualities because it'll blow over. So it was common sense and it worked. Kurt Vonnegut, since we're here at a literary festival, rightfully said Lake Erie is nothing but human excrement and Clorox bottles. Guys, it died. And I don't know if you know the Great Lakes, but the great fishing lake was Lake Erie. It was and is, and it's dying. Dr. Seuss wrote about Smeary Lake Erie and how sad it was that the lake was dying. But people rose, and people said, we can make a difference. And today, there's a group of environmental journalists, a society that tries to fight to get coverage of the environment in the newspapers and on the news, but it's not done in the way that it was in the 60s and 70s. It becomes, and look at our midterm election we just had. I think environment was like 5 or 6. And I will tell you, because I grew up in Georgia, I'm from Atlanta, but I grew up in Georgia and Ohio. I can go anywhere in the United States with a group like yours, and if I don't use the word environment and just talk about, if I ask people, shouldn't our beach here be clean? Incidentally, Nixon saved Cumberland Island as a national seashore. But if I came and said, we need to make sure our fish are well and our oyster beds, and we want to make sure the heritage of the Chesapeake's preserved, I'll get bipartisan support. But when I start using the word environment and climate change, I get a lot of this from the Republicans. And so I think the people all want the same thing, their kids to have a healthy planet, rivers that are clean, lakes that are clean, species saved. It just becomes a part of this partisan divide. And now the fourth wave may be coming in the United States out of states that are going to have to say, we're not going to sell any fossil fuel products by 2030, or like California's announced, or, they're just going to be states doing it because there is no way to get us unified right now. So I tell young people for the fourth wave, get involved. Don't get, whatever you do, never get depressed if you're dealing on environmental issues. It's about, you're a good person, you're trying to help save the planet, trying to help keep things green, pretty, and beautiful, but pick a localized issue. Become friends of the Okefenokee. Become, work on saving a particular bird species. Whatever it is, take a little bit, just put a few hours a week. And the one thing the baby boomers did was we injected ecology, earth science, environmental science classes, environmental law. There was much success in this third wave. But we haven't had a fourth wave, and the fourth wave will be global. It's going to have to be China and India to be proper. The progenitor of it might be United States, but don't be doomsday. Why they succeeded in the 60s, because they got small wins, and they started building the small wins into bigger ones. The idea of going to no gasoline right now, it's not realistic, so it's better to fight smaller battles and build your troops. And the moment will come when the politics are right for some really epic things to tackle the curse of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas Brinkley. That was wonderful. I'm sorry, that's all we have time for. Please don't forget the yellow buckets. If you can make a donation, you'll be helping us tremendously. Anyone who's staying for the next speaker, please move forward when you can, and enjoy the rest of the book festival. Thank you.